Okay, so this is the audio review for chapter 16, social change. Okay, so what is social change? So sociologists define social change as the transformation of a culture over time. So our culture evolves over time, and so do our social institutions, such as the family, work, religion, education, political systems, right? So if you consider how different life is in the advent of different technological eras or different historical epochs. So, for example, life today is affected infinitely by technology, right? So, children growing up today that have only experienced this kind of technology, especially smartphones, have a very different, I'd say, perception of that world than those of us who, existed in a world before that, where you would, like, I don't know, maybe ride a bike to have fun or things like that, right? So, how the culture defines what is normal within your own, kind of time period is often what you define as normal. So we often don't notice that the change is happening all around us because we're in it, right? It's not until we kind of look back reflectively that we notice the difference. So, social change itself can be deliberate or unplanned, right? Intended or unintentional. So, this just means that sometimes when you change one part of society, all the other social institutions have to adapt to that change. So, again, technology being that example. The idea that just a couple generations ago, if you wanted to communicate with someone across maybe in Europe, you would have to put a letter on a ship, right? Nowadays, you can FaceTime, you can Skype, you can call, you can email, you can text, right? You can reach people. Basically, this device you hold in your hands can send a signal into space and send that back to another person across the planet very quickly, right? So, as a result of that deliberate social change, there's a lot of unintended or unplanned changes that came as a result of that, right? Changes in the way that we interact with each other, right? The kind of addictive nature of phones themselves, right? It's not by accident that you are addicted to your device. It's because they're designed that way, right? So there's all sorts of other things that are changing as a result of this one technological change, right? So sometimes these things are planned, sometimes they're not. And some changes are more controversial than others. So I'll give you a few examples of that as we go on. Okay, so some sources of social change. The first would be major physical events like hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, things like that. The unprecedented fires that are happening in California. Demographic factors such as the aging of the baby boomers. Right now, about 10,000 people are retiring every day as a result of the large population of the baby boomers. And so, as they retire, how then does that change and affect different social institutions in society that then have to adapt to that change? And another one would be discovery of innovations, right? Obviously, the difference in the world before the internet and after the internet is incredibly different, right? Or, I mean, obviously, the quintessential fire, right? Obviously, before fire, we couldn't get a lot of stuff done. And of course, if you look at the way that these things work, the rate at which social change happens often varies. So it means that in some historical periods, you have rapid social change, like the changes that we've had recently because of technological advancements. And during other time periods, you experience more gradual change. So it's really easy to identify particular historical periods where a lot of social transformation was unmistakable. That we study these things in school, like the Renaissance, the French Revolution, the Civil War, right? Or even in the 1960s when the baby boomers were, kind of coming of age. You have the anti-war movement, women's rights movement, kind of college protest culture, right? But it's important to realize that social change is occurring at all times, not just at the moments that are really obvious to us, that are, changes to what we're expecting or what we're used to, right? So when there's sometimes more political or cultural upheaval, we can see it, but that doesn't mean that social change isn't happening all the time, right? So a lot of these contributions to social change have been made through collective action, right? Like the civil rights movement, which was, essential in bringing about more opportunities for people of color in this country. So, if you think about it right now, with the advances in technology, we're dealing with a lot more rapid social change. So, again, social change is often the result of deliberate or individual human action, right? So, the book gives the example of Jonas Salk, who developed the cure for polio, right? That one dude, basically, scientific curiosity led to having this, hopefully intended effect of curing or eliminating the disease. But that had a profound effect on what it means to be a child, right? Not having to deal with disabilities in the way that generations before had to, right? Or even Helen Keller, who overcame her own handicaps to advocate for the rights of the disabled, right? So her one really inspiring story was enough to humanize the disabled to a lot of people to then care and, advocate more for their rights as people. So, and again, the civil rights movement obviously fundamentally reshaped American society. So when people come together and push towards change, this is often the most, impressive way that we can mold society. So, collective behavior, there's a couple different kinds of collective behavior. So, collective behavior is just a group or crowd of people who form together to take action towards a shared goal. So, there's three types that are not mutually exclusive. In the real world, they may overlap whenever collective behavior usually occurs. So, the first is a crowd. This is a temporary gathering of individuals that is spontaneous or planned with a common focus. So, an example that could be like, let's say you're walking on the street and there's a street performer and a bunch of people stop to watch this person perform or like dance or something like that. Then that would be a crowd, right? A riot is a continuously disorderly behavior by a group of people that disturbs the peace and is directed towards other people or property. So the example I think they gave in the book was Woodstock 1999, which, because of my age, I remember very well that it was supposed to be this whole like Woodstock for a new generation and ended up being like incredibly problematic, right? Basically, because of the horrible conditions, it's supposed to be this financial success, cultural success, but instead they had very poor security and very high prices. They didn't have enough porta potties, so there was like no sanitation. And because of the conditions, the crowd started to get more and more angry. And so on the last day, they literally burned everything. They tore down fences, they broke into ATM machines. They basically set everything on fire. There was a lot of assaults. There were even sexual assaults that happened as a result. And so kind of watching that unfold live on MTV was very, I remember that very clearly. But anyway, so it's interesting. I put a picture down here on the right-hand side. Oftentimes you hear the word riot in response to protest movements against police brutality, or at least that's the way it's framed by the media. But those aren't actually riots, those are protests, right? Though we do have riots that happen all the time that are considered benign. And what they are is like this one pictured here at the bottom right-hand corner. This is a picture of someone celebrating their sports team winning, right? There's this messed up reality where if a team wins, if a team loses, the place where they're having the playoffs gets completely destroyed, millions of dollars in damage. But largely, since these are wealthy people, right? Think about how much it costs to go to a playoff game. These are often white people, right? Means that we see it as not that big of a deal. And it's literally characterized that way. There's some interesting research studies that look at this, the way that the wording of articles about this are portrayed versus protests like Black Lives Matter. So in these situations, they'll flip over cars and light them on fire, and it's considered people venting or, letting off steam. But when a person is killed, an unarmed person is shot by police, and people are very angry and they want to, express their anger, they're considered a riot, even though there's not the same kind of, like, there's not flipping over of cars and lighting on fire and these same kind of things. So it's interesting the way that the media likes to characterize that stuff. Not surprising, but pretty terrible because it really shapes people's understandings of these movements. And so mass behavior is just large groups of people that engage in similar behaviors without necessarily being in the same place. So this could be getting a bunch of tattoos, or this could be buying crap on Amazon, right? It could also include fads and fashions and social dilemmas that we'll talk about later. But collective behavior theory suggests that all these occurrences are often organized and maintained so that they can provide a certain sense of order. Okay, so when it comes to different theories of collective behavior, there's two main theories. First is contagion theory. This is this idea that individuals who join in a crowd or mob become, quote, infected by a mob mentality and lose the ability to reason. So this is one of the earliest theories of collective action developed by Gustave Le Bon in 1896. And so contagion theorists compared groups of people to like herds of animals and basically assumed that your individuality and your rationality just disappear and that the collective action takes over. The best example being, of course, the kind of Frankenstein pitchforks and torches, or I guess tiki torches in our modern era. So anywho, a more modern understanding of this is what we call emergent norm theory. This theory states that individual members of a crowd make their own decisions about their behavior, and that the norms are created through others' acceptance or rejections of these behaviors. So this theory argues that collective behavior is not as simple as Le Bon suggests, and that there are any number of factors that can motivate people to participate in crowd activities. So the group itself is guided by norms, or those shared cultural expectations for behavior that emerge in response to the situation. Okay, so when it comes to mass behavior, there's fads and fashions. So fads are interests or practices that are followed enthusiastically for a relatively short period of time. So an example of this could be Pokemon cards, or if you're a bit younger, Yu-Gi-Oh cards, right? Or if you're about my age, then you remember the one on the bottom left-hand corner, Pogs, right? So, that's definitely an example of a fad. And what's interesting about fads is that, again, they're a relatively short period of time that they're followed, so they can actually kind of be markers of a particular time period. So, like the Rubik's Cube, right? Kind of, you think of the 1980s, or the pet rock, you think of the 70s, which is a pretty hilarious thing to get people to buy. So anyway, those are things that it's kind of interesting how quickly they happen and they develop. Often so much so that parents can not really keep up with them, right? Or even not just Pokemon cards. Pokemon Go was a good example of this. Like it was kind of a flash and then it was gone, right? So there's a lot of those things that have a cultural meaning to them, but they're connected to a specific time period, right? And then fashions are just widespread customs or styles of behavior and appearance at a particular time in a particular place. So if you think about what clothing looked like in the 1960s, like if you're a fan of Mad Men, right, and you watch stuff like that, how it differed in the 70s. We're going through a little 70s time period right now, right, with the jumpsuits, the culottes, all that kind of crap. The 80s, the 90s, right, they have very specific fashion styles, though nowadays we're pretty terrible and we tend to just recycle the same crap from those previous generations, right? Little alteration here or there, and it's just the same crap from the 70s. But anyway, so, hairstyles are a great example too. Like, I'm a fan of the show The Goldbergs, right, which is supposed to take place in the 1980s. And they do a great job of trying to portray the fashion, the hairstyles, all of those, like, little fads and fashions of, like, what kind of hair clips people were, the scrunchie, the side ponytail, like things like that that were very kind of time specific in their popularity, that, again, are pretty quickly cycle in and out of society. Okay, so another issue of mass behavior are social dilemmas. So this happens when a behavior that is rational for an individual can lead to a collective disaster when practiced by many people. So, like, let's say, you're on the freeway and, you're thinking, okay, there must be a car accident up ahead because there's so much traffic, right? Everyone's really slowed down. So, basically, you finally get up to the problem and you realize it's just a guy who has a flat tire who's pulled over to the side, but everyone's slowed down to look at them, right? That kind of looky-loo problem that we have. Where if one person had slowed down to look, it wouldn't really be a problem. But since everybody does it, it causes like this major traffic jam, right? It's one example. Or even another one could be like, if again, another traffic related. If you're late to work and you decide, I'm just going to pop into the carpool lane, right? Just real quick. Get past the traffic. which I guess is okay if you're the one person who breaks that rule without a person in your car with you. But if everyone does that, then it becomes a huge dilemma, right? So, there's a lot of these kind of ways that things that we do as individuals, we don't realize the impact that we have because there's millions of us doing the same thing, right? So, like running your water while you brush your teeth instead of turning it off, right? Or taking long showers, like any of those kind of things. When we had the kind of height of the drought in California, there were water restrictions that were placed on people, right? Like not being able to water your driveway, which why the hell is anyone doing that anyway? Just sweep it, you lazy ass, right? So anyway, but there were restrictions placed on like how often you could water your lawn, which again, lawns are super problematic as well. Like why not grow, I don't know, actual vegetables or things you can eat? If you're gonna waste that much water we're in a desert, it turns out. Like it turns out none of this water is here by accident. It's all here by design because they dammed up valleys up north and then channeled all that water down here. So maybe we use it wisely. But anyway, so that idea, like if you take a little bit longer a shower, if you're not turning off the water when you brush your teeth, if you're the only person doing it, it's not that big of a deal. But when everybody does it, it becomes a huge problem and it becomes a huge waste of water, right? So that's just that kind of idea of how, some of these things can become social dilemmas. So some of these relate to tragedy of the commons, which is just when many individuals overexploit a public resource and deplete or degrade it, right? So, it's a tragedy of the commons. Like an example of this could be any of the stuff I have over here on this little picture. So overfishing, for example. There was a lot of time in human history, like the majority of human history, where we fished. But to do so, we would put like a string in the water with a hook, right? Or before that, like jab them with a spear or whatever, right? So there was kind of a limit on how many you could catch. And sometimes you didn't catch any at all, right? Versus nowadays, the way that they fish is industrial fishing. They use these huge nets that try to sweep fish into one direction. And then they put these like big ass vacuum things into the water and just suck up all the fish, right? So they can get thousands of fish in the same time it would have taken to get maybe one or two in previous generations. So it's no shock that because, and again, if there was one ship doing this, that wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the fact that this has become the industry practice means that we have literally in the last two generations destroyed 90% of the fish. 90% are gone. Like the turn of the last century, how many fish there are, 90% of those are now gone. We have 10% of the fish left. Why? Because we're putting weird vacuum things in the water and sweeping up thousands at a time instead of a couple, right? So that's one example of the tragedy of the commons, that we're really destroying the planet by doing this. And it's interesting, too, that there were plenty of fish that we didn't actually eat back in the day because they're disgusting. Like, what do they call that one? Orange Ruffy, I think is what they call it. The one it's actually called a slime head. If you've ever seen this thing, it's not right. Like, you wouldn't eat it if you saw it. But we're so removed from our food that we'll eat all sorts of crap. Like, we eat hot dogs. Those are literally like the entrails and buttholes. Like, they're like the worst part of the animal. Just all the clippings and leftover bits and skin are all ground up. And we eat, they're like an American treat. Ugh. Anyway, sorry. I'll just keep, it's gross. But anyway, so, as far as the fishing goes, like, for example, salmon. If you think about what color salmon are, they're pink, right? No, they're not. It's disgustingly gray. But we think they're pink because they dye them pink. Like, it literally, these fish are dyed a different color to make them more palatable to us. Because when you actually, if you saw like this gross ass gray looking thing put on your plate, you wouldn't eat it, right? So in an interest to make more money, they've really overexploited a lot of these resources, right? So that's just one example of the tragedy of the commons. I mean, obviously all these other ones are as well. Greenhouse gases, overgrazing, all that stuff. And then a public goods dilemma is basically when individuals have to contribute to a collective resource even if they're not going to get any benefit from it. So the one I hear the most that people gripe about in this way would be, oh, why do I have to pay for the K through 12 education system when I don't have a kid? Or, my kid goes to private school or whatever it might be. Probably because you went through it. or probably because you want to live in a society where everyone's not a complete idiot. That's a basic knowledge or understanding, because that makes us all like safer and saner and like better. But whatever. We know that an educated workforce leads to a stronger middle class, which leads to a stronger economy. But what the hell do I know except for that? So anyway, that's a whole nother thing too. All right, collective behavior. So social movement just refers to any social group with leadership, organization, and an ideological commitment to promote or resist social change. So if you can think of any in our recent history, we have a lot, right? Like even right now, we have like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, those kind of things are modern issues. So, if you think of issues from the past, obviously, the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, gay liberation, right? But something important just to point out quickly too is that a lot of social movements start on college campuses. So you have to really be aware that college students have a lot of power in changing the social conversation and the agenda in a lot of these ways just by raising their voices. So, Maus identified 4 stages that social movements tend to go through. So the first is that the public defines the problem. So this is the incipient stage where the public basically takes notice and defines a problem as a problem, right? In the second part, people start to organize, right? So as an example in regards to Fierce Screen Fire, right? Public defines the problem. So you have Rachel Carson, Silent Spring saying, hey, maybe all the DDT that's killing the insects, it's also killing the birds and the fish, and maybe it's also killing us, right? And then people start to organize like, hey, we don't want to be poisoned, like the Love Canal situation, right? We don't want to live next to a bunch of toxic waste because it's causing deformities and making my children sick, right? So people start to organize. But what often happens is the movement becomes more bureaucratic, right? So meaning that they have to, within that kind of like liberal ideology, and again, remember what liberal means is that you're trying to change the system from within it, meaning like the civil rights movement passing civil rights legislation, right? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, those kind of things, that would be bureaucratic, because to do so you have to kind of have like lawyers and more administrative people to develop these kind of things. So for the environmental movement, you have like the NRDC, like the National Resources Defense Council, these lawyers basically that developed guidelines that were then given to the newly formed EPA to put into law, so then they could sue the government when they didn't hold up those laws, right? But that's not something that's very accessible to like anybody, because to be able to do that, you'd have to be a lawyer, right? So it becomes more bureaucratic. It often cuts off people from that grassroots, which is more of level 2. And then so as a result, the movement goes into decline, right? Largely because you've cut off from the grassroots that really motivates and strengthens a movement, right? Coming from the people and their agenda and their message. So activism is just any activity that's intended to bring about social change. And because society is constantly changing, new social movements and different opportunities for activism are constantly emerging. Just as society changes, we change to meet it, right? As our understandings of social issues change, so does our need for activism around these issues. So there's different types of social movements, right? Emerging social movements may be characterized by whether they resist or seek to promote social change. So are you trying to resist the changes in society? That's a regressive movement, right? So just in a hypothetical, make America great again. Again, what does that mean? Just from like a linguistic perspective, it means to go back, right? So to resist. It's a regressive movement, meaning a better time in America, right? When America was great, which is kind of comical if you're marginalized in the society, because if you're marginalized, society's never been great, right? Like when has it ever been better to be a person of color in America? When has it ever been better to be an immigrant in America? I mean, it's still terrible now, but it hasn't been better. When has it been better to be a woman? When has it been better to be LGBTQ? More rights and protections now than ever before. So making America great again, like going back to a time, you're basically hearkening back to before women had rights, before people of color had rights, when people knew their place, when people only lived in the closet, right? That's what made it great. And you're like, no, because it wasn't great. It was only great for a very few amount of people, right? The rest of the people had a lot more to struggle for. So regressive is just when you're trying to push back against any changes. So this could be like the movement in California that formed Proposition 8, remember, that tried to basically say that marriage could only be defined as a man and a woman, right? Which eventually was deemed unconstitutional, right? Because, I mean, it's kind of a weird thing in America to say, like, you can have rights, but you can't. Because that kind of goes against the whole point of, like, everyone has rights and everyone is equal, except for you and you, because you're a woman, because you're a person of color, because you're gay, or whatever it might be. So progressive movements are those that are trying to push forward to change the historical issues within society, right? So like Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, things like that are trying to, like Occupy Wall Street was trying to bring awareness to the fact that 1% of the population owns the majority of the wealth and takes in the majority of the income per year. And they're also affecting our political structure as they pay off politicians to, write the laws and change legislation within their favor. So it's interesting that you have, like, down here at the bottom, you have, like, the Tea Party and Occupy are actually quite similar in the things that they're talking about. In, like, working class issues, job insecurity, globalization, right? The only difference was who the focus of the enemy or the problem was, right? Occupy saw the problem as the financial, political, government elite, kind of like C. Wright Mills' power elite, right? The people that make the highest concentration of decisions in society because they have the most power and privilege. So they had a real specific issue. They literally called it Occupy Wall Street because they literally set up shop across from Wall Street, right? To kind of call out the bankers and the people who had destroyed the entire global financial system because they were monkeying around with a lot of these industries self-regulating themselves, which means not regulating themselves. And so they caused a global financial meltdown. But none of them went to jail. None of them. And so they decided, like, that was time to occupy to say that this is wrong, right? Versus the Tea Party is looking at similar things, though a lot of their issues were more xenophobic. Like, they saw the reason that their jobs were going to another country, or the problems of their job insecurity not being based on automation or globalization, like led by corporate leaders. They saw it as a governmental problem, and they saw it as like conspiratorially, a Kenyan Muslim president was, I don't know. And it's hard to understand it really, but really it's kind of more of a fear mongering based on an idea that that the instability that they're facing isn't necessarily caused by, these global financial issues. They're caused by immigrants taking their jobs, or they're caused by, low wage workers of color, or people that are on social welfare assistance, or things like that. That the government is too big, and if you got rid of how big the government was, somehow magically, magic wand, all these jobs would happen. Because it's all the regulations that are strangling corporate America, and you're like, corporate America is the most profitable it's ever been, and wages are the flattest they've ever been, but it's also that union membership is the lowest it's ever been. There's a relationship there, meaning when workers don't have power, they have no way to collectively bargain, they don't have any rights, they don't have any way to fight back against their wages getting lower and lower, their jobs being, taken away. So anywho, it's just a different perspective on the same issues, ironically, right? The Tea Party and Occupy have a lot in common when it comes to the kind of underlying issues of capitalism that are making people, unstable, right? Whether it's student loans, whether it's the high costs of mortgages, right? Any of those things. Or job insecurity, right? The people don't face those things in a politically partisan way. You face them because you're poor, right? But how people interpret that and then form social movements has a lot to do more with their ideology. Okay, so when it comes to technology and social change, one common characteristic of, theories is to put an emphasis on technological determinism. So, sociologists have tried to develop a lot of theories to explain how technology works in social change. And we just basically argue that technology is going to continue to play an increasingly important role in every aspect of people's lives because society is going to continue to transform from more of a modern to postmodern society. So, some of the ways that this works, again, technological determinism, just the idea that technology plays a defining role in shaping society. So, part of this is cultural lag. This just refers to the time between changes in material culture or technology and the resulting changes in the broader culture's relevant norms, values, meanings, and laws. So, material culture is that kind of, technological innovations, right, that can change a lot more quickly than those values. So it causes a lag between those two components in culture. So sometimes, like let's say cell phone technology became very ubiquitous for a long period of time, but it took a while before we started putting laws on how you can be on your phone and drive, right? That you have to be hands free or things like that, because it took a while for the norms and the values around, traffic safety to catch up with the innovations and the widespread use of cell phones, right? So sometimes there's lags in those things. Cultural diffusion, it just refers to the spread of material and non-material culture to new groups of people, regardless of the movement of people. So the book example talks about how TV shows and other media are integral in spreading U.S. culture. So meaning people in other cultures learn about what the U.S. is by watching our terrible TV shows. So think about like what the Kardashians is doing to our image around the world, right? So obviously a lot of other ways culture spread globally, right? Immigration, economics, governmental stuff, international groups. But really, media, the fact that everywhere around the world people listen to our music, they read the books that come out from here, they watch the TV, they watch the movies, and in those things have a lot of our cultural value systems. And like, sadly enough, an example of this is the fact that around the world, one of the highest or best selling products around the world is skin whitening cream. Our media is kind of known for its saturation of whiteness that, like the hashtag Oscars So White a couple years ago tried to deal with. The idea that the majority of characters on television, film, all of these mediums are white, right? The majority of stories are being told from a white middle class perspective. So it gives this kind of idea that that's what America is, which is not true at all, right? So again, these kind of value systems, or the ideal sense of white beauty, gets promoted through these forms as a kind of subtle hidden message of the medium itself, and that tends to spread like wildfire. All right, cultural imperialism, something on the test, refers to the culture's influence caused by adopting another culture's products rather than imposing military force. So it's imperialism like a lot of places around the world, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, crap like that is pretty much everywhere, right? These are now multinational corporations. They're not, or transnational corporations. They're not necessarily like American companies anymore. But it's the products. It's the Apple Watch. It's the, all this crap. It's considered, American products that get spread around the world that largely kind of imperialized without having to move in tanks, right? People just kind of like willfully adopt that dominant culture stuff, right? And cultural leveling is the way where societies lose their uniqueness and become more similar. So this is kind of like, it comes back at us, right? Meaning, yes, a lot of places around the world listen to our music, watch our movies, and blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot of stuff that's kind of made its way into our culture that's really popular in other cultures, like, Japan has had a large influence on our culture through like manga, anime, stuff like that, that has really, obviously there's like billions of dollars in those markets here, so it's still a very popular thing here. Or, if you think about just the influence of, like France, like we drink their wine, we eat their cheese, like there's certain products that we, strive for from there. Or like, another example could be like Korea, like K-pop, right? There's like a huge market for it in the US, right? So those are just a couple examples of ways how like it's not just a one-way process. Yes, our message and we are pretty dominant, especially in our media system, so a lot of our stuff goes out there. But now you have a lot more like Bollywood and like stuff like that coming back to the US in some popularity. So it shows that eventually we start to level out. And of course, it's not just television and media, right? It's also like our technology tends to level out, our medical science, those kind of things. As we share more with each other's cultures, we tend to kind of get more and more similar. Okay, so living in a postmodern world. So to understand postmodernism, you have to understand modernity. So modernity is just basically the social conditions and attitudes that are characteristic of industrial societies. So this means a decline of tradition, right? So not being monarchies or religious hierarchies, typically, that were kind of in the eras preceding this. There's an increase in individualism in our culture, way too much so. This rugged individualism that's kind of super toxic. But again, this idea of like looking at your own life, right? And a belief in progress, technology, and science. So that's not so bad, right? Well, it just depends on how blind we are to any of the limitations of these things, right? So, for example, as you saw in Fear, Screen, Fire, there was this idea before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out that man had control over nature. We could throw all this poison on crops, on people, on whatever it was, and we were controlling it. We had domination over nature. That's folly, right? That's this like grandiosity that we think we know better than nature, right? So that was kind of the problem. Like there's been a lot of issues in the past as far as science, medicine, technology, where we made mistakes. And a lot of those things were based on our bias, right? And so that's kind of what postmodernity is all about, is being more critical, right? Like for example, if you think about seatbelts, right? If you're a female, you're probably not stoked about seatbelts because they're horribly uncomfortable, but largely because they're not designed for women, they're designed for men, right? Crash test dummies up until the 90s weren't often female at all. So this idea that like the unassumed hegemonic position of society was male meant that a lot of medical research didn't even test pills on women, right? They would just give them to women and assume they worked the same way on women as they did on men. Things like this that were really upsetting that now we can look back at and be like, oh, that's terrible. But it's a lot harder to see how we're still doing these things. We're still affecting the kind of research that we have today by the values of our time right now. So this is why postmodernism really looks at being skeptical of science and technology. It doesn't mean like not believing anything or being like fake news, fake this or anything. It just means like not getting sold, right? Like understanding the basic tenets of research methods, which is why I forced you through chapter 2 in this class to like learn that this is all based on something, right? Social research methods that are attempting to produce information that's valid and replicable, right? That because that's how science works, right? It's the process of peer review to make sure that what you found wasn't just a one-off or a fluke, but that it's something important that can be added to the kind of general body of science. So it's not as if science is gone or that we should never trust technology. It's just that we should be skeptical about how we're using these things, right? Like there's some people that have issues with the driverless car technology, right? Which actually, yeah, just hit a person for the first time recently. Or just any of these things, the kind of way that we use the internet, but we don't realize how much it's tracking and storing our information and selling those to advertisers, right? So that's kind of, postmodernists would look at that instead of saying, yay, the internet's perfect and, is great. Or I think another example of this that I hear a lot is a kind of modernistic idea that the technology is going to save us from climate change, right? No. The only thing that's going to save us from climate change is a social movement. It's people getting out in the damn street and starting some stuff. Otherwise, that's just never going to happen. We're all going to boil to death and die. That's all that's going to happen, right? Or, I guess it's hyperbole to say we're all going to boil. Some of us are going to roast in wildfires. Some of us are going to get swept away in hurricanes, etc. You get what I'm saying. Larger storms, more extreme weather events, etc. Right? So people always say, oh, well, someone will develop like a technological advancement that'll change this and we'll be good. Yeah, see, that's already happened. Those technologies already exist. There's companies like GE that every year put on these kind of expos for all these young engineers, especially environmental engineers, to develop new technologies that can like strip plastic out of the ocean or microplastics. As nowadays we are learning that now people are being found with microplastics. Like basically, you cut open any fish or bird out in nature, you're gonna find plastic in them. But now we're filled with plastic because we're eating these things. But anyway, so a lot of this research looks at how um, we kind of take for granted that, okay, science is going to fix it. But in actuality, again, they put on these research expos so these people can present all these like fascinating technologies that like replace the combustion engine with something that is completely renewable and the only byproduct is like drinkable water, right? Stuff like that. These things actually already exist. But what happens is these corporations that put on these, interesting research seminars buy those technological advancements and then they develop them and then they save the world. No, just kidding. They don't develop them. They set them on a shelf somewhere so that those new technologies cannot compete with their current status quo business model. Even if that thing makes us burn up and die, as long as they still make money until the death happens, they're good. So the only thing that's really going to change it is a large social movement where people get out in the streets and fight for it because the technology is already there. Putting all our faith and trust that like someone else will do it and it'll happen, we forget that that means like there needs to be political will and social will to actually make those things happen, right? So that's kind of the difference between modernity and postmodernity is, we're kind of past that, focus on modernity where, we kind of put a lot of our trust in that. And we're more in this postmodernity where we have more characteristics of post-industrial societies, right? Where we're more focused on like information jobs and, a little bit healthier skepticism of these kind of things.